welcome back to another EP World History Lecture. Hey, we're finally at the end, and this is your big review for the 20th century. Now, there's a lot to cover in the 20th century, and to be quite honest, I can't cover it all in this short of a video. But what I am going to do for you is give you the broad strokes about what happened with the 20th century and really give you a sense that the 20th century is really about the attempt to solve all the big problems that we've been studying about over the last 3 centuries. Things like European imperialism, things like technology, racism, nationalism, and economics. This is going to have to be quick, but I promise I am going to add another resource for you, a podcast where I went a little bit more into detail on things. So hopefully it's going to help. Let's get going. So first off, let's talk about the beginning of the century. The beginning of the 20th century starts with this incredible hope for progress. We can see this in some primary examples. The use of fossil fuels, the widespread use of electricity, the creation of rocket technology with the belief that we were going to be able to go into space, the use of diesel engines with cars that gets widespread for people at this time period, and of course, the use of factories and mass production. But that all gets challenged when we hit World War I. Now, remember from class the big mistakes students make. They all think that the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand is what caused World War I. But it was those underlying causes, what we like to call the main causes of World War I, that really got things going. And that was what had culminated over 3 centuries with Europeans: militarism, alliances, industrial violence, and nationalism. By the end of World War I, that had led to the deaths of 10 million people, which really causes the problem there. However, that's a kind of Eurocentric interpretation of World War I. What do I mean? Eurocentric is when we focus on Europe throughout the entire thing, which makes sense. Most of the war took place within France, but the war spread out. For example, the Ottoman Empire joined up with the Germans, and when the Germans lost, the Ottoman Empire fell, creating chaos within the Middle East. Also, Europeans used troops from all over the world to fight for them in places like India and South Africa. Why does that matter? Because those people learned from the Europeans and then got their language, and that's going to come up later when we talk about decolonization. Now, of course, by the end of the war, the belief was they had solved these problems. We weren't going to see a major conflict like this ever again. Of course, Europeans are wrong about that. And that has to do with the Great Depression. When the Great Depression took place, radical new governments arose, like fascism and communism. And of course, that eventually led to World War II with a much more disastrous consequence. 30 million people died by the end of the war. And a big part of that had to do with the erasure of the division between civilians and the military. You want to remember that because that's going to be really important for this. Now, by the end of the war, atomic bombs are going to be used, and that really erases the difference between civilians and the military. But the other big thing that's going to happen is genocide. Now, the first genocide that took place was with the Armenians in World War I. But of course, the big one that we all remember is the huge violence that was done against the Jewish people in Germany during World War II and the Holocaust. What's important is that's a culmination of nationalism, racism, and the use of technology, industrialized violence, to create that kind of a massacre of people. Okay, when the war is all done, we get into the conflict of communism and the Cold War. Now, in the 1850s, when Karl Marx developed his theory of Marxism or communism, he really was going after inequalities in industrialized areas. He thought for sure revolutions would take place in places like Britain, France, and the United States. Of course, none of that takes place. All of the communist revolutions took place in traditional agricultural areas like Russia, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. And because of that, we see very different outcomes than what Marx thought was going to happen. In the case of Russia, we saw a rapid attempt to industrialize, with Stalin being a centralized authoritarian leader, and he tried to get rid of all of his opponents in this process. Plus, Stalin used 5-year plans in order to try to industrialize really quickly, and he starved out the Ukrainians. By doing that, led to massive deaths. In China, Mao Zedong attempted to industrialize his country through the Great Leap Forward, having 10,000 people collectivized together. And then when that didn't work, he then tried to justify it with the Cultural Revolution, in which he tried to blame Confucian leaders and massacre them at the local level. So what was the end result in communism? Well, kind of common in the same places. We ended up having rapid industrialization in these countries, but then the economy stagnated and we had authoritarian governments. Now, in response to this was the Cold War, and the United States saw the Russians and the Chinese and other groups who had become communist, and they assumed what was called the domino theory, that communism was spreading everywhere, and they tried to contain it by surrounding it with militaries. Well, there was a guy in the United States named Walter Lippmann, and he warned the United States. He said, hey, look, be careful. If you divide the world up into communism and capitalism, good and bad, you're going to make a huge mistake. What was this mistake? He believed that a lot of countries were going to choose communism as a way to free themselves from European control, and that communism in many cases would become a nationalist interpretation at local levels. It had nothing to do with the Soviet Union or China. In many ways, he ended up being right, and it showed the big mistake that the United States was going to make. So that, of course, gets us into the next phase of decolonization. Remember, this is the time when countries are trying to get away from European control. Remember World War I? We talked about troops fighting for European countries and then learning their language to talk about how they needed freedom. Well, this is when that's taking place. Of course, our big movement that demonstrates it is Gandhi in India. Gandhi establishes that nonviolent movement to break away from British control. After that, we see a number of decolonization movements in places like the Gold Coast in Africa, Ghana, in Cuba, in the Middle East. Countries around the world start to see the need to break away and have their own independence. Definitely wasn't a perfect process. In fact, ethnic differences within areas, religious differences within areas tore these countries apart. India is a good example where Muslims and Hindus fought a civil war where 3 million people died. Then you had a partition between India and Pakistan. However, the other big problem is going to be inequalities, and these are going to be exploited by transnational companies, companies trying to do trade around the world, creating inequalities between countries. So that gets us to our final big movement of the 20th century, and that's globalization. Globalization starts after World War II with the Bretton Woods Conference, when they created the IMF and the World Bank that provided loans to developing countries in order to grow and develop. Also, we had the Green Revolution that allowed for modified foods that helped to support populations. We also saw the development of computers and new types of technology like satellite technology and Wi-Fi. All of these things have helped for countries across the world to develop and grow in trade. And a big part of trade has been helped through things like the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to lower tariffs and get trade coming out more and more. What are the positives of doing all this? Well, increased global economic trade. We've seen absolute poverty decrease. We've seen cultures widespread throughout the world. But we also see those negatives that we were talking about. Negatives like, for example, inequalities between countries growing more and more. We're also starting to see problems with global climate change that's taking place. And the other big problem has been the use of social media through the widespread use of terrorism. So what are our takeaways? In the end, there are 3 big ones I want you to think about. Number 1, the 20th century began with an incredible optimism and hope for technology and progress, but it ended with a lot of skepticism and questioning. The other thing we want to remember is that the 20th century is the culmination in the attempt to solve the problems of the last 3 centuries: European imperialism, nationalism, and racism. And then last off, the last big thing I want you to remember is the development and now our new problems that are coming out of this. Coming out of this, we see huge inequalities between countries. We see at the same time relative poverty being a big problem. Global warming has become a problem for us in the environment. And last off, all of this has led to a questioning of whether or not countries should be isolated or if they should be open, with fears today of people coming into countries. So I hope this helps to get you ready for the 20th century. I know it was a quick run through of everything that's going on. It's a lot that we have to cover because the 20th century had a lot going on. See you in class.